So this is where we get into early prop monoplanes. At this point, aeronautical designs have been improved, wherein they take engines and they start building purpose-built or aircraft, basically aeronautics takeoff. No pun intended. And with that, you would see a rise in specific aviation engines. A lot of these planes, a lot of early monoplanes would actually just be biplane, essentially biplanes, but with the second layer of wings removed. Now you have planes with an increase, with a greater increase in speed and a greater horsepower and torque increase of your engine or your RPMs of your engines. You're able to gain these the simply put, you're able to gain the speeds. Now there are some times where you're the you, and also this was where flaps come into play. Flaps would help you take off and uh, to slow yourself down a little bit in dogfights and so on and so forth. And flaps would become a major player in prop planes from starting here. In fact, the you had planes where such as the P-26 P shooter, the American plane up in the top left. It was able to mirror the performance of of the First World War biplanes in its turning speeds and its ability to climb, and yet still be a monoplane. It just had a more powerful engine and had more RPMs. Essentially, these monoplane, and furthermore, monoplanes also allowed, since you have a lot less drag, don't eat up your fuel as much, and you can go farther with these things, and even sometimes faster. Actually, no, actually, a lot of the time faster. Not to mention, there you had also a lot of quality of life upgrades to these planes, where you would there's a it was more so you had just overall quality of life things that was killing a lot of pilots in the First World War. You had a lot of those issues remedied and fixed in these, or start to be fixed in these era of planes.
The major thing with these aircraft is simply engines got better and more materials for airplanes became more available due to construction methods improving. Um, and the better materials were added allowed because the engines were in fact better. Because people took a look at biplanes and said, we need better engines like yesterday. Because on a biplane, remember, aside from the frame, you have a fuel tank and an engine. Your frame cannot get better if your engine is not better. Because in that case, you are, for the most part, just increasing weight without increasing power, which means that you have a lead brick that you're trying to fly. It's not
You
going to work.
at that point, your plane compared to the First World War one is less than useless now.
Yeah, it is effectively a harmless paperweight that you keep in a hangar. Now,
It looks nice.
with
That's about it.
with the innovations with aircraft, they were not. It did not come without its problems. Uh, Mostly due to global politics. There were plenty of instances like Russia basically trying to rebuild their air force with people who didn't were a whole lot less experienced with building aircraft, and it resulted in some pretty terrible airplane designs in the 20s and 30s. A couple of countries tried experimental designs, trying to redo some of the airframe designs that in the 1910s and see if maybe they were on to something. A lot of those do not did not work like they did not in the 1910s. Some of the countries were really confused on what kind of role they wanted their fighters to fulfill. Do we make them more armored? Do we try to make them fast? Do we make good climb? Do we give them cannons? Do we give them machine guns? What do we do? And it leads to a bunch of mixed results. You get really good planes. Uh, P-29 was a good plane. Um, it functioned very well. I'm trying to think of another good example. I think that in the bottom left hand corner, that is like an HE 100. No.
It's a BF-109E.
Okay, BF 109E. Um, I don't know why I said HE 100. It's wrong cockpit.
And you have
Uh,
stuff like the P. I think it's the P-36 Hawk, the
yeah, Brewster
or
Buffalo, I think, would also go in here. There was technically it got designed like late into the 30s, but the British tried to make an airplane where you would use the tail gun to shoot down bombers. It performed horribly, as you can expect. It was slower than the bombers. It's kind of hard to shoot something behind you when they're in front of you. Um, so this is probably the most mixed bag where you have excellent plane designs existing at the same time you have terrible planes. Because like for every I-15, you have stuff uh, like uh, the previously mentioned British aircraft, where it's trying to use rear guns to shoot down bombers, which I guess would technically kind of make it a fighter aircraft. Or,
all in all, the direction the planes were going to go was having an identity crisis at this point, and
unfortunately,
was trying to, and it was a necessary one to have, and it was going to figure itself out.
yeah. But planes like the I-15, I-16, good planes, good planes. Um, but which is weird. Russia at this time's really weird, especially when you study their aircraft, because they'll make like a really good airplane or like a half decent airplane, and then they'll also make one that's basically unusable. But other than that, I think I'm good.
Good as well. All right, let's then then we see from here we see the results of the progress and the struggle that the fighter plane would go through during this time in the culmination of its prime, of the prop plane's prime. And these planes are the peak of their upgrades. At this point it has figured itself out. The prop planes have. At
Um,
this point, you put on you you have even more powerful engines, increasing the advantages of that were previously stated. But you also have a greater altitude as well. You start going into higher because of bombing, mostly because of bombers. So, and you say with escorts, you have you develop drop fuel tanks to stay in air longer, and you have planes specifically designed to operate at atmosphere for a lot for longer and more effectively. For example, the P-47 was designed to operate at altitude, at bomber altitude, with peak um, combustion efficiency. It ended up being a ground attack aircraft, but that's a completely different story. We'll get to that later, actually. Foreshadowing. And all in all, it's these planes would take what the successful elements of the early monoprop planes and would just excel that.
this these are the planes that, uh, with a little bit of overlap, these are the planes that go into World War II. These are, for the most part, brand new. They've buffed out a lot of the problems from similar interwar designs. Russia got its stuff together, started building Yak 9s like it was no one's business. BF 109s, they fixed a couple of the issues that early German aircraft had. The P 51s um, were significantly better than similar aircraft like the P 40s, P 40 Warhawks. They're
Don't get me wrong, P-40
faster,
Warhawks
better
were
turning.
the P-40 Warhawks were good planes in and of themselves. They just performed poorly at Pearl Harbor because the air crews that were crewing them, the idea was that we just have the air crews there that are training how to fly the thing.
Oh,
But when we get war declared, we'll train them, right?
well,
But
I think that was just a consideration of bad showing. You've got units like the Flying Tigers that use P-40s against
mhm.
Chinese against competitive Chinese aircraft like Zeros, Oscars, and they absolutely hose them.
And then you
Well,
have the British who used them in North Africa with different weapons, but they used P-40s and continuously upgraded them, and they kicked tail with those things.
yeah.
And but what was yeah, with the P-51? It also had a bit of an identity crisis. It was
Supposed to
slated
be
to
a
be a ground
ground
attack.
attack.
Yep, it was supposed to be ground attack aircraft, but because they figured speed would mean it could dodge all the incoming fire. But it turns out, even if you're moving fast, you still can take a hit. Well, you'll still take a hit, and it's your ability to shrug off or to recover from that hit is what's really important. P-51s weren't P-51s weren't great at that. They would take a hit and their engines would start dying out. If they took a single hit to their engine, it's over. But at altitude, these things performed stellarly at altitude. They could turn at a really high rate, almost on par with the 109. I think actually it's and later upgrades by I think 44, the P-51s were outturning 109s, and
I
furthermore, their ability to
it's
get
you.
to altitude
I think
was even greater.
most of the problem with like beef. While the P-51s were getting better, you also have to remember the BF-109s weren't getting any better themselves, partially because their factories no longer existed.
And their resources were being pumped into different projects.
It,
That has not slipped my mind.
so they were skimping out on parts left, right, and center.
They
They
were pulling some Boeings.
they were pulling a Boeing. Uh, it, so it can't. They were also running out of experienced pilots. Germany was not in good shape when like the good, in quotation marks, uh, later models of P-51 started rolling around European airspaces. Even one of the other things you start to see during like uh, the beginnings of World War II is use of stuff like twin engine fighters like the Mosquito, uh, stuff like
P-38s.
P-38 Lightnings, Me-410s. Um, the Russian one is somewhere in my head and it just escaped.
And those things would increase your speed, but your turning speed kind of did suffer a bit from those designs because they had to be bigger. Um,
Your big
because
drawback
had,
is your turning circle. It's
but your
just
ability,
bigger.
but your their main advantage is, especially with something like a P-38, was to carry cannons and to just zoom and shred whatever you came across and then leave.
Yeah, pretty much.
Um, I'm good with when it comes to this slide.
I'm good here. Um,
So from there, from the prop, you would think how could prop planes at their prime actually, real quick. Hold that thought. Remember the foreshadowing I did earlier? Yeah, here we are. Specialized roles, fighter bombers. So, the the story I'm gonna talk about the P-47 at the bottom right there specifically. The story with that one was it was meant, as stated earlier, meant to be an altitude fighter, meant to fight with the bombers and escort them. But turns out that they weren't. This was a symptom of a coincidence as well. They weren't too good at dogfighting because the P-47s that were escorting the bombers were R-22s, which had a propeller issue. The propeller simply was just too small. It would not draw in enough air, and the P-47 would suffer as a result. It wasn't until the R-25 and the R-28 came along did the propeller get even bigger, and that would allow it to perform at a great skill to the point where they said, okay, but even then, this thing should not be an escort fighter. So what are we going to do with it? Can we put bombs on those hard points? Yes, we can. And that's what the P-47 ended up doing. It replaced the P-51 and the P-47 essentially did a tag-in, and they swapped roles. So that goes to show you that equipment designed for one role can end up serving in a completely different role. This was in a very, very fortunate coincidence, I would say, for these planes. The P-47 could take a hit and keep flying. If it lost a cylinder, no big issue. This thing was so large, the engine was air cooled. Even if you lost oil pressure, that's not great, but you could still make it back. You could still run, and you could make it back without catastrophic failure if you did it right. And pilots were trained on how to do that. And furthermore, and then this goes to these planes as a whole, to all of these planes, the Focke-Wulf, I think is that an Oscar? The top,
No,
I believe that's an Oscar.
That's a Jake.
The top
I
left.
think.
And then
Oscars.
I think that's
Oscars.
yes. Right.
The cockpit's more forward. They've just
You're right. That is that is a Jake. My bad. I am sorry. You're a good plane. And then you have the Hurricane at the top right. With all these planes in particular, all nations at this point had strike aircraft or strike aircraft
Typhoon,
that would be stuff like your.
You could technically say the IL'd.
Things like your IL-2s, your Dauntlesses, your Stukas, your Helldivers.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my brain actually just broke. Yeah, the IL-2, which is kind of arguable because you can't really fight aircraft in it because it's a flying bunker. I know you can do it in War Thunder, but I would not recommend it at all.
I was referring to strike aircraft. You had every nation had a strike aircraft, so it was essentially a mix between a fighter and a bomber. Bombers obviously they drop bombs; that's their thing. But then strike aircraft, say it's a lighter target, say a convoy or just a target that doesn't warrant a whole bomber wave. Well, you get a strike aircraft for that. Again, your Dauntless, your Stukas, your Helldivers.
Oh no, I get that.
But I'm putting Helldivers in the tags there. The Helldivers, your Val dive bombers, and these are your strike aircraft. However, these required a completely separate airframe. They required completely different training with that in mind, and it took multiple crew in order to fully service this vehicle or crew this vehicle. From there, you could do the same job effectively with a P-47, a Focke-Wulf that you just attached bombs to. But crucially, when you dropped your payload, you just took a lot of weight off your wings. Now you just freed up your mobility, and you're able to evade and to maneuver now, because strike aircraft had an issue with fighters coming after them, because you just now essentially alerted the horde. Oh no, you just did alert the horde, and now you got a bunch of planes coming after you, and they're pretty pissed off. So strike aircraft would go down in numbers because of that. They did have turreted guns, but it was you can only do so much with those because in comparison to the fighters pursuing them, strike aircraft could not maneuver in comparison to the fighters. And the turret guns, and also you can't maneuver because the turret gunners have to keep a solid platform in order to fire adequately. So, what
Um,
if you just use a fighter to be able instead once dropping your payload? Well, I've just turned back into a fighter, and now I can effectively defend myself.
yeah, some of those examples I would agree with. Some of them I don't like. A Val is not going to fight anything. It's got two machine guns, I think, and that's it. It's made out of
Hmm.
paper. It can't really turn. It's slow. SPD Dauntless can. It's got some pretty nice guns on it. It has a good turning circle and it's reasonably fast.
No, I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. It's that you had that I'm saying that strike aircraft like those could not, or in comparison to a fighter, when it comes to a dogfight, they can't as effectively dogfight. So if you give a fighter bombs and then when it drops, it jettisons its payload, you've now you a fighter can defend its. You can now have a your strike aircraft, i.e., your fighter bomber, defend itself with a fighter.
Okay,
It
I
itself being a
misunderstood what you're
fighter.
saying. My I am just a little bit tired. Um, but I just misunderstood. My bad.
Okay,
The
I was about to say. I was about to say.
Because I was about to say, my brain was like Val fighter
No, no,
bomber.
no. I
What
was just
the?
saying. I was po it. I was just my point was that the role of the fighter bomber posed the question: why are we producing an entire subsection of all this industry and training for these aircraft, yet we can just train our pilots on fighter bombing, who are already experienced and have one airframe for two different roles.
Yeah, pretty much. You can use it as air support or just general air superiority.
Hmm. And in fact, you would have flights of P-47s escorting P-47s, but these had payloads on them, and one was equipped for fighters and one was equipped for payload. And then after the ground attack P-47s did their work jettisoning their payload, now you have an entire two wings of fighters fighting off the enemy forces coming after you.
Yep.
So the logic of the fighter bomber would, and more importantly, set up the multi-role ability of fighter planes going forward.
Yeah. Although
That is all I
I
have
would,
for this slide.
uh, unlike stuff like MBTs, where basically right after World War II, everyone has basically figured out MBTs are the way to go. The multi role fighter never really got off the ground until like late 70s, early 80s with stuff like the Crusader.
Yep, stuff like the Phantom, the those kind of things. Those didn't take off as fast as um, ground forces, NBTs, and so on and so forth. But mainly due to other things. We'll get into that in a little bit. But that's all I have for this slide.
Yeah, that's all I have.
Now that was part two. We went over prop planes and their early configuration, the monoplane specifically, and then the prop planes and their primes, your BF 109s, your P 51, so on and so forth. And eventually we got to the specialized role of fighter bombers that a lot of prop planes found themselves in. So as a result, this is the ending for part two. So with that said, you have a good one now. Get back to work.